I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me.
What does it mean Messiah matters?
It means apart from him we can do nothing. It means he is the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeshua is the only way of salvation. He is everything. We have to have the Tanakh to know the Messiah.
But we have to have the Messiah to know the Tanakh. Without Messiah, we have nothing.
Basically, it's all about the Messiah. It's Wednesday, March 28th, 2018. This is Messiah Matters number 211. Trying to cram 26 people around a table that fits 10. My name is Caleb Haig. And with me, from a home that smells so much of incense we can smell it from the other side of the mountains, Rob Van Hoff. What up, Rob? How's it going, man?
It's going very well. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Passover.
does. I was in the garage this morning. It reeked like incense.
You got to tell people now. You got to tell people
A good
now.
friend come over and who does like stellar photography. And he's like, hey, let's use your garage and we'll do some cool photography of smoke going up like incense. So I had to go to the store. We got like, I'm looking at the incense section. This is like the part of the store that I always walk by. I never go like at the natural food store. I know they have like this hippie section with like different kinds of soaps. And I'm like, if anybody's going to have incense, they have it. So I go there and they have like 20 kinds of incense. I'm like, I don't know what to buy. So I just asked the lady working there. I'm like, I just need a big, like, some
Nog
kind of
Champa,
good
man.
smoke.
Nog Champa.
Well, I don't know what that is. So anyway, I just grabbed one of them. And anyway, we're just like, woo. We had to open up, let that air out a little bit. But hopefully we got some good pictures of smoke. It's really cool. The idea is you're blocking it off, right? So that there's not a lot of draft, so that the smoke can go up. And then getting real high-res, well-lit pictures of the smoke. And you can zoom in and you can see little particles that are spiraling up with the smoke. Embers or whatever. Anyway, that's why the incense joke was there.
That's why the incense joke was there. You're right.
We were not. There was no religious significance given any of that.
Dude, Passover is 2 days away. Friday is Nissan 14. Very excited. Are you ready?
More errands today, more things to do today. But we've done cleaning and various.
How many are you having people over to your house, or do you have we're
gonna have
community
people over here?
A community
we're
Seder.
having people here. We the last several years we've encouraged people to have their own home Seders, which is really cool because that way it's it forces people maybe to do a Seder and kind of go through that learning experience, which I think is really important.
Excellent.
And it's good because you have the more intimacy. You have the smaller groups is good.
How many people you having?
Don't know yet.
What do you mean you don't know yet?
My wife's like, we need to know by today. Like, well, we have unsures.
Our table is, we start planning the guests list about 2 weeks after Passover ends. So in about 3 weeks, we will begin preparation for Passover 2019.
How many people are you having?
Including children, 26.
At your place?
At my house.
Wow. That's great, man.
For those who don't know, I don't make a lot of money, and my house is really quite small. So 26 people crammed into my house, it's a lot. And people will probably end up sleeping in various rooms. Yeah, it's a big ordeal. we definitely have fun. We decided to turn my backyard into a roasting pit.
So it is an altar
No.
that someone saw
But we
down
did
there.
get a whole lamb. And my buddy, who is probably the best barbecuer on the West Coast, he's going to be doing the lamb. And it's we got people coming from Montana, as we always do. Our good friend Adam and his wife Mary and their daughter Yofi are coming to stay with us. And we always have a farewell to 11. They always come over the day before, and we go to BJ's for which is a pizza joint. It's a chain, and we get the deep dish. It's going to be excellent. All right. Well, happy Passover to everybody. Welcome to everyone in the chat room. Good to see you in there. This is Messiah Matters. Pardon me. Messiah Matters is brought to you by TorahResource.com. Go to Torah Resource for all of your Torah resource needs.
For all your Torah, yeah.
Torah Resource exists to provide biblically based education for disciples of Yeshua. You can find all sorts of free stuff and great resources to study the Bible. We have commentaries, we have articles. There's a ton of free stuff. It's amazing to me every time I look on the site. Again, it reminds me how much stuff we have. It's quite unbelievable. And whether you're on our mailing list or not, we have a promotion going all the time where you can get something free just by signing up on our mailing list. And we just decided today there's a couple of there's going to be 4 audio lectures that you can download for free by signing up to be on the mailing list. And if you're already signed up, don't worry, you'll get free links to them as well. But basically, it's all 4 lectures are on identity. So Jews and Gentiles in the body of the Messiah is one of them. Identity and one Torah. There's 2 lectures on that, and so on and so forth. So anyway, keep your eyes open on the website for that promotion. It's always a good one. And then also, once again, and I didn't make a banner. I apologize. I feel like a slacker to our sponsor today. Chava Messianic Radio is sponsoring show 211. We are very grateful to Judah over at Chava Messianic Radio for his support of this show. I want to let you know this. Chava Messianic Radio just got an app, and you can get the app for iPhone, for Android, and for Windows phones. And so I would highly recommend it, because that way on the go you can listen to all of your favorite Messianic music. And actually I found some good music just the other day on Chava Messianic Radio. So it's, they have everything. If you want, if you want like Messianic bluegrass, you can find it at Chava Messianic Radio. I guarantee it. So anyway, download it, listen to it in the car while you're working out, whatever it may be. And also, last but certainly not least, Messiah Matters is brought to you by the generous support of our listeners. And this show, believe it or not, this blows my mind every time I say it, this show is listened to by thousands of people around the world every single week, which just is mind-boggling to me. But it is, I apologize, I forgot to start the radio broadcast, which... Oh, well. So Messiah Matters is brought to you by our listeners. And if you want to become a supporter of Messiah Matters, you can do so for as little as $5 a month. That's right, $5 a month. You can set up a recurring $5 a month support for Messiah Matters. You can do that by going to TorahResource.com, then hovering over radio, and then click on Messiah Matters. And as soon as you get to that page, over on the right-hand side, there's a button you can click to become a $5 a month supporter of Messiah Matters. Every single penny counts to keep these microphones on and to keep this a free resource for people all around the world. Okay, with all of that said, let's jump right into it. And by the way, I should say, we have already had several people sign up to be monthly supporters of this show, and we are blown away and just beyond grateful for the people who've decided to help get this show on the air every single week. And so we really, really do appreciate it. Okay. Last week, I said something, and a brother in the Lord at the congregation I go to gave me a what for on my comment. And it was in reference to 1 Corinthians 11. I said that I thought that this letter was talking predominantly about the Passover meal in the diaspora. Now, this is largely opposed by most scholarship. I know this. I get it. And of course, most Christian scholarship is going to say, no, they already thought the law was done away with. They were instituting a Eucharist. Okay, well, that's a whole different matter. But what I said was in 1 Corinthians 11, I thought that Paul was saying you shouldn't have unbelievers at your Passover meal. This brother in the Lord basically gave me a nice reaming out and said, hey, man, some of us have situations where that is really a difficult thing because we have a wife who is a believer and a husband who's an unbeliever. So what do? Tell the wife she shouldn't bring her husband, these kind of things. And then he also made a very interesting insight into 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 34, which we will read in just a second. I want to speak for just a moment about the idea that we should split up a couple if one's an unbeliever. I think that, first of all, this ultimately comes down to each person and the person hosting the Passover Seder. There's a group in Tacoma, and they have it's something ridiculous, like 6,000 person Seder every single year. And obviously, you're going to have unbelievers that would come to that. Is there something wrong with that? I don't think so. And certainly, I think that Paul talks about in this same letter. He talks about how if there's a believing wife and an unbelieving husband, and she sanctifies the husband. These kind of things. Okay, so I think that obviously we should not be breaking up couples. But here's the insight. Do you have anything to say about this before
No.
we read this?
No.
Okay. I want to read this entire passage because I think it's worthwhile to do so. And it says, this is 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 34. I'm reading out of the NASB. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord, Yeshua, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Now, I'm going to pause here for just a second. We've talked in the past couple of shows about 1 Corinthians and whether or not this is instituting something new or whether or not it's talking about a Passover meal. I believe that it is talking about a Passover meal. That's neither here nor there at this point. Let's pretend, for all those who disagree with me on this, let's just pretend for a few seconds instead it is talking about a Passover meal and go on. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But a man must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks judgment to himself, if he does not judge the body rightly. For this reason, many young among you are weak and sick, and a number sleep. But if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord, so that we will not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so on and so forth. Okay. The observation that this brother in the Lord made to me was that Paul does not say, examine other people to see if they should be at your Passover meal, but examine yourself. In other words, this is an inward-looking. We need to be right with the Lord ourselves and not to judge what the other person is. Now, this is a really good point. And the reason why is because if you look in the beginning of 1 Corinthians and the sexual immorality that is going on among the Corinthians, I don't know if there's probably some liberal churches today, but most conservative churches and even Messianic congregations that are conservative in belief, that is, I think would probably not only kick somebody out or tell them they shouldn't come if they were engaged in the same sexual immorality as the Corinthians, but they'd probably excommunicate them. Yet Paul seems to say, I mean, it's very odd how he kind of deals with this, and tries to get them to see the light, so to say. So once again, now we get to this passage, and he says to examine yourself. I think this is a good point, and I think that I have to retract what I would say.
If someone's willing to come, like you have a married couple,
right?
One of the spouse is a believer and the other is not. They can, if they're willing to come, right? If they're there, then that represents the unity of the couple, right? And so, yeah, there's
also other situations where somebody has what I would call the sin of the high hand. In other words, they say that they believe, they walk according to they say that they believe, they go to a congregation, so on and so forth, but their life is not exemplary of, they're living in sin and are not repentant of said sin. Should this person be at the Passover meal? Once again, we get into husband and wife. Maybe the wife is living in sin, the husband is not. And when I say living in sin, this could mean a slew of different things. It's not one specific sin, or vice versa. Husband is living in sin and claims to be a believer, but the wife seems to be genuine and living a life unto God. What do you do in these kind of situations? Once again, I think that this comes down to individual homes, individual congregations, leaders, and what a leader would say and what a leader would, I think every single situation is different, and I don't think that we can just make blanket statements. And this is about these kind of things. This is exactly why I think that judges are set up within the tribes in the Torah, right? Moses' father-in-law comes and says, look, you're taking on way too much. And this is essentially where the Judaism gets the concept, and I think it's right. Ask your local rabbi is what modern Judaism would say, and what Judaism has said for a very long time. And what that means is don't try to ask a governing body or look at what the faith statement of a denomination is. Rather, ask on matters of halakha, that's matters of way that we walk out our faith. Ask the leaders of the congregation you go to, which is why I think it's very important for believers to be in community. This topic is far-reaching in many ways. So I retract what I said last week, and I would rather say I think that 1 Corinthians, my buddy here is right. It says to examine yourself, and we should look inward during the time of Passover. And not only should we look inward, but I think that whoever is going to be at your table is up to either the leader of the house or the community that is that you're a part of.
In that, I was thinking about Judas. Yehudah,
right.
So Yeshua says, I didn't choose you 12, yet one of you's a devil, right? And Yehudah, to some degree, was part of the Seder. Now, he leaves sometime during the meal,
right?
Because he goes and organizes with those who are going to come and capture Yeshua in the garden. So, but Yeshua didn't exclude him outright, and that's worthy of some thought. I don't have any particular insight to offer from that, other than it's just there for us. It confronts us. We're confronted with Yeshua accepting Judas into the Seder and presumably washed his feet.
Right.
So,
can you imagine that? That the person in front of you is the one who's going to betray you, and yet you still wash his feet. We have to assume that he washed his feet because his disciples say, "Hey, why'd you wash all of our feet except for Judas?" Right?
Right. Yeshua did not single Judas out until it was he allowed Judas to follow the path that he was on, that he was pursuing.
So, Eliyahu in the chat room, was the Last Supper a Passover meal? The answer is yes. I've done several live streams recently on this. You can go to TorahResource. This is great. Thank you. This helps me plug various Passover resources that we have. Go to TorahResource.com. Go to the articles section. Well, he says, I don't think so. Well, you're allowed to be wrong, and you are. Anyway, go to the chronology of the Passion. Obviously, the Synoptic Gospels tell us that it was a Passover. It says that it was the day that the Passover lambs were sacrificed. Yeshua tells them to go prepare the Passover. They go prepare the Passover because he wanted to eat it. And then he's sitting down at dinner, and he says, I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you.
This Pascha. Yeah,
this Pascha with you. It's obviously a Passover meal. And if you
it's, the slaughtering of the Pascha is there.
Right. And if you have a problem with that, then I would encourage you to read the article, The Chronology of the Passion, which can be found. Oh, thank you. Mike just posted it in the chat room. And if you're not in the chat room right now, if you're listening to this somewhere else, then go to TorahResource.com.
Clearly there's a history, there's traction out there that the Johannine hypothesis, having a separate chronology than the synoptics, that has traction out there. That's a well-worn road, and people are going to, a lot of people are going to presume that.
Please don't take this the wrong way, everyone out there, because I know that there are scholars who still hold to a Johannine hypothesis. But scholarship is, especially in the past 20 years, is largely moving away from that. In fact, I would say with Dr. Petrie's work, with some of my father's work, and with Joachim Jeremias and others, I think that the Johannine hypothesis is starting to fade into the background because scholarship has made extremely large strides in this, and it all comes down to the language of the Greek language of the Gospels. Anyway, we've talked about this at length. You can actually go to our last Passover special from 2017 and see us interview Dr. Brant Petrie, and his work on this has been tantamount, I believe, in the scholarly community. All that to say, I think that those who still hold to a Johannine hypothesis, who are not in the scholarly world, probably do so because they are not aware of a lot of the work that's been done in the recent, in the past 20 years. And that's not any fault of anyone. And you know what? I admit there are people who disagree with me strongly, even though they've heard the evidence presented. So this is one of those non-salvation issues that probably won't get worked out until the Messiah comes back. But hey, whatever. Actually, I will say there was a post I saw on Facebook recently, which was a really good post. And that post basically said, John and the Synoptics all say the same thing, that the emphasis should be on redemption, which is true. It's the redemption that we have through the Messiah Yeshua. Okay, let's move on. And if you want to jump into this conversation, please go ahead. Call our comment line, 253-465-3205. It's 253-465-3205. You don't have to talk to anyone. It's just a comment line. It's a message machine. You can yell and rant all you want. You can tell us we're wrong, whatever, and you don't have to talk to us. Or you can send us emails if that is more up your alley. Chegg, that's CHEGG at TorahResource.com. Chegg at TorahResource.com. You can also email Rob Vanhoff, R. Vanhoff, 2 F's in Vanhoff, R. Vanhoff at TorahResource.com. Okay, with all that said, let's move on quickly. I have to hard stop at 10:30 today. So, with all that said, I put something in the show notes, and if you don't get the show notes, you should get them. You can get them on our site. But I put something in the show notes. It's an article from Torah Resource on the meaning of the word Pascha, which is Passover. And as the language teacher, Rob, why don't you expound on? I think that a lot of people just means to skip, right?
Right. Yeah, this is a good topic for our, meditation for this time of year, coming into Pesach and Feast of Unleavened Bread. There's so much rich meaning and significance spiritually for us. One of the things that can sometimes get by us is the word Passover. We just take for granted the word Passover as capturing the name of this Chag, of this feast. And in fact,
Right.
it's Pesach, right, in Hebrew, Pesach. And we first see it in Exodus 12, right? And it's used both as a noun. It is Pesach Adonai. It is the Lord's Pesach, and as a noun. But in verse, what verse is it? Is it verse 11? Pardon me. I think it's verse 11. He says, Pesachti alechem. This is verse 13. The sign, it says, the blood will be a sign upon your houses. And it says, V'raiti et hadam. I will see the blood. This is Exodus 12:13. Fasachti alechem, and I will pasach over you. So,
Right.
so there it's a verb. So in Exodus 12, when we're introduced to this verb, pe samek chet, we see it as a noun, Pesach la Adonai, a Pesach of Adonai's Pesach, and we see it as a verb, like here in verse 13, ufasachti alechem, I will pasach you, over you. And so we traditionally take this as Passover. I will pass over. So the idea is that like the afflicting angel, the angel that's taking away the firstborn, is coming through from house to house, and they skip every time they see the blood. They skip over that house, and that's the image that I learned when I was a kid.
Right.
Passover, like, oh no, we're not going into this house. But in fact, if you look at the Targumim and even the Septuagint, so we have in the Greek translation of Exodus 13 and in the Aramaic translations, they translate it with the word to protect. I will protect you. And the image is different. The image when we take Pesach as to protect is one of God's wrath, right, coming down, basically, is the bigger image, but it's the angel of death, right, to kill the firstborn, is everywhere present. It's coming down equally on every home, but there is a protection over the homes that have the blood, and so it doesn't get into that house. That house is protected. It's not a matter of a dance, of a skip, right? It's a matter of a shielding and a covering and a protection.
Don't you think that this directly correlates with the image, like the courtroom imagery that we have of Yeshua actually standing up on our behalf and fighting for us?
Right.
In other words, he's protecting us in the courtroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's what's interesting is that we know that we've talked about this before. There's good work been done in the ancient Greek translation of the Torah. They often used, well, not often, but in key places, they used Aramaic terms to translate Hebrew. In other words, instead of translating the Hebrew term into Greek, they use an Aramaic word in its place. And Pascha is one of those. So in other words, the Greek Jews that read the Septuagint, when they get to this word, they preserve the word Pascha, which is Aramaic, not Greek. And what that tells us is that they had an Aramaic strata to their language infrastructure. They were probably bilingual or trilingual, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek.
Right.
Maybe primarily Greek at this time, but they still had tradition associated with Pascha. Pascha is not translated for us by Yeshua or the apostles. It's just taken for granted. But we do see it start to separate. There's one stream that takes it in later, as the church history develops, rabbinic history develops. One stream takes it to mean protect, like we talked about, and one takes it to skip over. And both are present, for example, in one of the early rabbinic midrashim, in the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael, where the Mechilta, which is now granted the texts are late, but it's associated with the 2nd century Tannaitic literature, if you want to take a rabbinic literature class and know what that is. But they associated the word Pesach with Isaiah, with the verse from Isaiah 31, where the verse it's used. It says, like flying birds, this is Isaiah 31:5, like flying birds, so Adonai of hosts will protect Yerushalayim. He will protect and deliver it. He will Pesach and rescue it. So the image here is a bird hovering over and protect with wings over Jerusalem, protecting.
Right.
And so there's a split in the midrash of the Mechilta. Some take it. The first instance is taken as this protection, and then another voice says no, take it as skip over. And then there's a citation of Song of Solomon where it says, the voice of my beloved comes dancing on the hills, and the idea is actually that there is a kind of passing over. So very early, first century and beyond, we do see this split in interpretation. But if you look at the Greek and the Aramaic, it's clear that protection was the dominant meaning, particularly like with Isaiah 31 is a great example, where the verb has a strong history of meaning protect. And I think, just like you pointed out, Caleb, being in Messiah is a locational type of metaphor.
Right.
Like in Romans 5, Paul says, therefore being justified by faith, we have shalom with God, and we have access through Yeshua to the grace in which we stand. In other words, there's a positional, what they call positional righteousness. It's a metaphor of space, of location. We are in Messiah, and it's his life that we have. We participate in his resurrection, and the only way we participate in his resurrection is if we have died with him. So, and this takes us right back to the imagery of Passover. And to be in Yeshua is to be basically in a home, right, wherein the firstborn is redeemed, has life, and we participate in that life and we celebrate that life. So anyway, there's a great article. It's I think it's just 2 pages or so, where Tim Hague takes you down some of the scriptural verses to show some history of this verb pe samechet, from where we get Pesach, Pascha, and then popularly Passover.
I have also linked that article in the show notes, which I would encourage everyone to receive. You can receive our show notes by going to TorahResource.com, hovering over radio, go to Messiah Matters, and then you can sign up right there for our show notes.
Well, if I may, one other point is if you look at one of the Targums, because we have more than one Aramaic translation, one of them translates it not as protect, but to have compassion. I will have compassion on you.
Interesting.
I will have compassion over you. And so the idea is there's an element of remembering the covenant, of remembering that God has a promise here, and that this wrath, this punishment on the gods of Egypt and the wiping away of the firstborn is not going to touch the firstborn of the sons of Israel.
Right. Okay, great. Let's move on. So today's probably going to be a little bit of a shorter show, and the reason why is because I have a hard stop. So it'd be nice to I have a meeting I have to get into at some point soon here.
Well, can I share one other thing?
No, you're not allowed.
Mechilta.
Of course. Go.
Is that this is pretty early, Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, and it takes that same verse, so verse 13 of Exodus 12, where it says, Ra'iti, it says, I will see the blood, right? Ra'iti, I will see the blood. And what the Midrash says there, it says, Mara'ah, what did he see? Dam ikadato shel Yitzchak, the blood of Isaac.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in other words, and the tie is in First Chronicles 2. Remember when David takes the census, First Chronicles 21, and then the striking angel comes, right? Because he wasn't supposed to take a consensus, or a census, not a consensus. But anyway, the idea here in the Midrash is that the blood is what is seen, the blood of Isaac.
Right.
And what is the blood of Isaac? That reminds us that Passover has to do, it's a good midrash. It reminds us that Passover doesn't just have to do with the children of Israel in slavery. as that God just he just saw a suffering people and just thought he should help them out. That's
Right.
not what's going on here. It goes back to a promise to Abraham.
Yes.
And that is so important, because then we have to ask, well, who is Abraham and why did he have a promise? And who is the children of Jacob? Where they are the children through Isaac.
And
who
what is
Isaac?
the promise? I mean, we've already talked about this in previous shows, but remember that the Abrahamic covenant has to do with the Messiah. And not only is, the Exodus is totally wrapped up with the firstborn son and
Akedah, right?
and with
Yeah.
circumcision. You can't eat the Passover lamb unless you're circumcised, right? God goes to kill Moses on his way down to Egypt because one of his sons isn't circumcised. His wife has to do it for him, right? So circumcision is wrapped up, and the reason why is because the Abrahamic covenant and the coming of the Messiah, salvation through the Messiah, is 100% wrapped up in the Exodus from Egypt.
Even Isaac's name was given by God. You shall call his name Yitzchak, right? And he became God's,
right.
right? He became God's. Good.
So there's another article that's in the show notes on the Last Supper the Passover Haggadah as symposium, which is interesting, and we don't need to touch on it. But here's one thing that I was thinking, and I haven't even talked to Rob about this, but let me just bounce this off you. I wonder if we could look at Yeshua's exposition at the Passover meal from John 13 through John, what is it, the end of 17, I think, where he's talking at the Passover meal. I wonder if there's any kind of correlation to what's in that article. That's why I included that article in the show notes, is because I thought it was really interesting how there was kind of these set prayers or these set structures
that would be,
within
you could
this.
go and look through that, yeah.
Right. Okay, so that actually will bring us to our next topic. Asher, who has been a wonderful source of topics for this show because he always tends to ask provoking questions and good questions.
And they're good questions. They
Yeah.
show deep engagement with the topics, and he's done his homework in terms of language and
Right.
text history and etc.
He says, I understand from one of the previous shows that drinking of wine at Yeshua's Passover meal was part of the Greek dapnon. And later on, and dapnon, for those who have not caught our past shows, dapnon is just the word supper. But within the Greco-Roman banquet, dapnon was separated from other aspects of the supper, like the symposium, which would be the drinking part of the Greco-Roman banquet, or the philosophical talking part of the banquet, so on and so forth. So the dapnon was like the main course meal part. So he says wine at Yeshua's Passover meal was part of the Greek dapnon, and later on the rabbis incorporated elements of the dapnon into the Seder. This is true. At least the evidence certainly weighs heavily in this direction. However, he says, Yeshua seems to assign significance to the drinking of the wine. I agree wholeheartedly. He says, is he giving it significance as coming from the dapnon, or has it already been incorporated into the first century Seder, and then he assigns new meaning to it based on that? So basically, here's what I'm hearing Asher ask. What was Yeshua taking Greco-Roman tradition and making it his own and giving significance to it, or did Judaism already take that and give significance to it, and now Yeshua is taking it and making his own significance on Jewish tradition? That's how I hear his question. There's several things that should first be noted here. Within the Greco-Roman banquets, especially the symposiums, and this we have literature of this up to, I think, 400 BCE is where we start to see the Greco-Roman banquets talked about in this way. There were ceremonial cups in the banquet ceremony. And so, for instance, at the beginning of the meal, a cup of wine mixed with water was dedicated to the good deity. And then once the dapnon section of the meal was over and it was going to become the symposium part, the drinking part of the banquet, there was a unmixed cup of wine that was dedicated to Zeus. And so I actually think that this was not necessarily pagan all around. In other words, I think that this became common banquet tradition in the Greco-Roman world for everyone, not just for the Greco-Romans, but also for the Jews and the surrounding people, right? Samaritans, so on and so forth. And I think that we actually see this even in the Last Supper, right? In Luke 22, we see him, he has a cup, he breaks the bread, and then it says, and then after supper, and he has another cup, right? And he dedicates another cup. Mm-hmm. So our friend Asher writes, and stop me at any time or jump in here. He says, or has it already been incorporated into the first century Seder? This is a very difficult question to answer because we don't think that there was a set Seder. In fact, Seder is probably a later invention by Judaism. Were there set prayers? Yeah, there probably was set prayers, but they weren't set across all Judaisms. In other words, what Yeshua did at his Passover meal could have been specific to him. It could have been specific to certain groups in Galilee or whatever. Whether or not the Pharisees had the same prayers or the same rituals that Yeshua and the groups like his had, we have no evidence of that. We have no evidence of set prayer at the Passover meals until the Christians come along, right? The liturgical scholars will tell you that by the time the Gospels are written in the 50s, now we have set tradition of believers. In other words, the believers have now incorporated things that Yeshua said into their Passover meals or whatever, their Easter celebrations is what the Christian scholars would say. So I think, okay, hang on, let me back up for just a second. There's also Christian scholars who say that there were set prayers and that the breaking of bread, for instance, Daub is one who says that the Afikomen was already a set Jewish tradition and that Yeshua just takes that over. I think that basically this is my personal opinion, I think what happened was you had Greco-Roman tradition of multiple ceremonial cups. I think that became just cultural tradition that wasn't necessarily religious in nature, but was perhaps cultural in nature. And I think Yeshua now takes a cultural element that the Greco-Romans probably used it religiously. The Jews probably used it religiously as well. But I think Yeshua takes this structure and he gives the significance to himself. And that is very unorthodox. I think that is what was so different about what Yeshua did at the Last Supper, is that he puts the significance on himself. But I think it was probably more of a Jewish custom at this point, or it was a Jewish custom, and it was also a Greco-Roman custom. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think it is... we know, like, what can we say that we know? We know that ancient Israel was a wine-producing people, right? I mean, they produced wine. So for them to have a special wine, maybe not ritual, but to have some sort of wine culture that becomes part of meals, especially right, special meals, would not be surprising. So we can think of this, independent of external larger world. However, wine was something that was shared culture. In other words, people sold wine. And that's why, one thing we know is that the Greek word for wine, oinos, and the Hebrew word, yayin, and the Phoenician word, yayin, is all the same word. So we know that when you have different cultures that have the same word for an artifact or for some sort of produce, cultural product, that it probably, the diffusion of that term across cultures means that they probably shared, they traded, and there was some sort of shared wine culture in appreciating wine. On the other extreme, well, one other data point. We know from the Book of Jubilees,
right,
which is not Pharisaic, right? It's and it's 2nd century, roughly 2nd century BC.
Right.
Yeah, BC. So it's Second Temple period. We know that drinking wine is an expected part of celebrating Pesach. So we do have that data point. And then what do we have on the other side in Jewish tradition, like we looked at, I think it was last week, we looked in the Jerusalem Talmud, and we noticed rabbis debating the 4 cups. They took 4 cups for granted, but we had different rabbis giving different types of significances. One was these are the different statements from Exodus 6, which kind of has the one that wins the day later in tradition. One, that they're the different kingdoms of the world. One says these are the different cups of the wrath of God. So you could envision a Deipnon, right, with any one of these templates. Like we're going to do a Passover Seder and we're going to talk about these as each cup as the kingdom of the world. And we have scripture, like it is in the Jerusalem Talmud. There are scriptures citing that are given to be cited for each, according to each of the 4 cups. But the Bavli, we looked, and there is no such discussion. That rabbis don't record any of that. They just say the 4 cups represent cherut, which is the word for freedom. So we looking at that range, right, just in the Jewish world. And then we look at the influence of the Greco-Roman Deipnon, and that other cultures were doing the same thing. Multiple cups during a meal with specific theological or other significance specifically marked out as set apart in the telling of a story, or with a mythology, and like if it was Zeus or something, they would have had some sort of myth that it's all kind of brought to mind during the meal, because it was a special meal for them. So I think that all these data points over time and cross-culturally are important to keep in mind.
So Gary in the chat room says, first of all, he's right, we need to emphasize that there's no monolithic Judaism here. There's all different kinds of groups, and even within Pharisaic circles, what the Pharisees did over here is not necessarily what the Pharisees did over here. The idea that there was set liturgical prayers in the synagogue, there's no proof of that in the 1st century, so on and so forth. So, I mean, we have to detach our minds from the idea of Judaism as the Judaism that we have today was what was going on then. That's not at all the case. But Gary says this. He says, I sense an underlying insecurity in the body of the Messiah, especially in the Hebrew roots / Messianic part of the family that seeks certainty. What I find in this conversation that is in these kind of conversations that is more likely the case is that people have rose-colored glasses on for Judaism. In other words, they think, Judaism is ancient, and so it was around when it was around before Yeshua was here.
Yeah, like it's a pristine, unaffected, unmingled.
Right. And we see this we see this a lot from people who, of course people say things like, of course the New Testament was written in Hebrew. Hebrew was the language of the people. They didn't speak Greek. Greek was the enemy, blah, blah. That's totally not true. We know that's not true. We know that most the rabbis were writing in Greek, the leaders were speaking Greek. The Torah had been translated into Greek. People didn't understand a lot of the Hebrew and Aramaic, so on and so forth.
And even the Mishnah says a Greek Torah scroll. There's no problem with a Greek Torah scroll.
Exactly. And so the point here is that what I see with the idea of the Deipnon and even the idea that Yeshua would be continuing on Greco-Roman tradition that had become just cultural tradition is that people, especially Hebrew roots and Messianic, a lot of Hebrew roots and Messianic believers, they don't want anything that could be perceived as pagan to be incorporated into anything that Yeshua is doing. In other words, if you look at the Deipnon and the symposium of before Yeshua's on earth, it's very pagan in the Greco-Roman culture. And so the idea that this was now adopted by Jews, why would the Jews of the 1st century and prior, why would they adopt things that were pagan? Certainly they wouldn't do that. Well, that's not the case. The case is that in fact these became very cultural things, and that culture is something that we as believers, even, my culture in America is much different than the culture of a believer, say, in Japan or in the Middle East even. The culture is different. And we have different cultural understandings and traditions and these kind of things. Well, the Jews of the Palestine region, Jerusalem, and all these things in the first century, they had adopted a lot of the Greco-Roman culture, and so I think it's offensive to a lot of Messianics and Hebrew roots believers to think that Yeshua was now engaging in something that could be Greco-Roman instead of Jewish, but the evidence is clearly pointing to the fact that these were cultural things that had been picked up by Yeshua. Now, I think Asher's point is fantastic, that certainly the Jewish sects of the first century had adopted these cultural things. They didn't adopt them as pagan traditions. In other words, it's not like they all of a sudden were praying to Zeus or something like that because they had adopted these Greco-Roman traditions. No, they took the elements that were not pagan and they reorientated them, most likely. At least I assume that they reorientated them towards God and Judaism. We see this in the later Mishnah, right? The idea of multiple cups, the idea of leaning, all of a sudden they're putting significance on it that means something to Judaism, instead of retaining, some kind of pagan meaning for everything. With all that being said, I think that Yeshua is now taking just a structured meal that was common in the culture and probably had religious significance among, different sects of Judaism, and maybe even different religious significance among religious sects. And
but you're not going so far as Daub, though.
No.
Daub's gonna take what you're saying, and he's gonna say, yeah, not only was there an existing common tradition among pious families, but they had this thing called the afikomen,
right?
Afikomenos, and they had a special bread that they told the story of the coming Messiah with. So, and it's a beautiful idea, but I'm a minimalist. In other words, I want to see data. The reason why I'm hesitant that way, and people who know me, I'm hesitant with that kind of thing, because there are so many sensational things that whip in really quickly when you open the door. And it's
right.
like, show me, like that's why, like, we look back to Jubilees and we can see, okay, Jubilees sets the Akedah at, right, it's on the 12th of Nisan where Abraham's told to take Isaac. And then when it says on the third day he saw the place, it's like, well, 12th, 13th, 14th at night, right? I mean, it's
right.
It's all set up. And then we see in the later the Mechilta, like we looked at, there's this tradition of the blood of Isaac, of the Akedah, which obviously never was shed. That's the other thing here, is that this is the act of faith that Abraham gave, right? He never actually slaughtered, although there is one little stream in rabbinic midrash that Isaac was slaughtered, but of course we know that's not from the scripture text. Anyway, all this is I want to see the data. I want to see the text and the history. And so, Caleb, sorry, I kind of hijacked that, but I wanted to point out that you're allowing for a space of a tradition, which I think is good and right. But and back to Gary's point, now I don't have the chat room open, but Gary's pointing this out. It's like, look, we have to accept creativity. We don't have to be worried, about this. But it does seem that there was some sort of tradition, and I bet it would vary. I bet families that had strong family traditions had different ways of doing it than others, and it was okay.
So I haven't researched this, and maybe this is something we can do for next week, but it would be really interesting to me to start to understand when the Seder plate came onto the scene. It has to be super late, right?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Maybe that's something for next week.
The same book, that volume 5 of the Liturgical Tradition series. I don't have it out anymore. But Yuval has a second article on Passover in the Middle Ages in that same volume. So have a look. And that's his specialty, actually. Yuval's specialty is Jewish-Christian polemic in the Middle Ages. And that's his book, Two Nations in Your Womb, I think it's called, referring to Rebecca's, the twins, right? Jacob and Esau, of course.
Right.
Because in the rabbinic imagination, they, at some point after the Christianization of Rome, so sometime 4th century, the rabbinic midrashic world starts to imagine the Malchut, which is the Christian kingdom, as Edom, as our older brother, which is ironic. Why would they think of the church as their older brother? Although they're saying he's has hostile intent and is up to no good, they're still conceding that whatever they're calling the church is an older brother, which kind of makes it sound like, we're responding. Our traditions aren't as old as Esau's. But
so,
that's a side note.
Helen in the chat room says, isn't it just how each family remembers? Can't it just be open to the best ways of teaching children and new believers to remember what he did? I agree. But it's important to research and to know what we're doing. In other words,
know the story.
In other words, a lot of Messianics and Hebrew roots believers will fault the church for why are you bringing a tree into your house to celebrate the birth of Christ? Why are you celebrating? Why are you having Easter egg hunts and these kind of things? You're not thinking about what these traditions mean. Well, I'm not saying that there's necessarily anything wrong with what's on the Passover table in modern times today, and maybe some of it is just to teach the children. However, one thing I've learned about Judaism, things are never quite that easy. In other words, there's always a lot of reason why something is done, and the thing that we don't want to do is blindly carry on tradition. That and I'm not saying that you
got to play that clip. The rabbi, he never.
So yeah, I know.
Do you have it?
I don't, and the reason why is because I have an external hard drive that had to be moved. Anyway, not the point.
Okay. Anyway.
Well, maybe that's something we can look at next week. But
there's a reason. If someone asks a question, an answer will be created at the very, very
exactly.
Least. But the educational element, was it Helen? You said I did. See, that's a great point. And this is another really cool thing I think about smaller Pesach gatherings in homes, is that it encourages more leaders to dive in and prepare to lead the Seder and to tell the story.
Well, and the other thing that this does is it prepares us in knowing more and more about what was actually there. In other words, when we understand, okay, Yeshua had the lamb, he had matzah, and he was celebrating the Sabbaths. Okay, this is what we know. This is what we know about what Yeshua is doing. Now let's look at the Gospels without the preconceived notions of a modern Seder, and let's see what Yeshua is doing. I think that helps us study the Bible better. Okay, I hope that everyone has enjoyed this. Make sure to give us a call. You can call us on our comment line, 253-465-3205. You can also send us emails, chag@TorahResource.com, chag@TorahResource.com. Become a monthly supporter of the Messiah Matters show so you can keep us on the air. You can do that at TorahResource.com. And, of course, get the new app from Chava, Messianic Radio, on your iPhone, Android, or Windows phone. Okay, I hope that everyone has an amazing Seder on, let's see here, 2 days, on Friday evening. And we will be here next week, of course, to talk about Passover and to talk about our Seders and all those kind of things. I hope that your Seder will do one specific thing, that is to glorify our great God and Savior, Yeshua, the Messiah, because it's all about the Messiah.